So to conclude with our different types of loops that we took a look at, I want to take a moment to just briefly discuss how you might go about deciding which loop you want to use in a particular situation. So there are going to be different situations to consider when using each type of loop. Essentially, you should consider each loop a tool necessary for addressing a different problem. So to briefly go through this, the while loop is ideal in situations where you need a pretest loop that terminates based on some condition other than a count, such as a Boolean flag. So a good example of this was when we were dealing with those sentinel values for calculating and running totals, where we don't necessarily know how many items that the user wants to add together or to process in some way. So instead we rely on a sentinel value and some kind of condition other than just saying, as long as this value is less than some upper limit or greater than some lower limit. So the while loop is ideal for those kinds of situations. The DoWhile loop is ideal in situations where you need a post-test loop that terminates based on some condition other than a count, again, such as a Boolean flag. So a pretty good example of this, it's essentially going to be the opposite of the kinds of situations where you would use a while loop. So you ideally want to use the while loop when you want to guarantee that your loop will execute at least once before you would terminate it in some way. Or the DoWhile loop is good when you want to execute it at least once before you terminate. The while loop is best when you want to do the opposite of that, when if the condition is initially false, you just go ahead and don't execute it at all. So a good example with a DoWhile loop would be when you're dealing with input validation. You know that the user is going to be asked to provide some kind of input at least once, because in order for them to move to the next part of the program, they need to be able to provide whatever value it is that you're asking for. So a DoWhile loop is pretty useful in those cases. You also might have noticed that based on how you would handle input validation with a while loop versus a DoWhile loop, you might have noticed that the DoWhile loop is a bit more concise. So in that sense, it's a bit more manageable, a bit more readable in your code. And then finally, if you're dealing with a for loop, this is going to be ideal in situations where you need a loop that terminates based on some count. So in any kind of situation where you know how many items you're going to be working with, or precisely how long it is that you need your loop to execute for, the exact number of iterations, in any of those kinds of situations, the for loop is going to be ideal over the while loop or the DoWhile loop. And that also includes situations where you might ask the user to provide a value that determines how many times you're going to step through that loop. Even in situations like that, because of the conciseness of the for loop with the initialization, test, and update expressions, any situations where you know how many items you're working with, the for loop is going to be preferred over the while or DoWhile loop. Okay, so at this point, this is going to wrap up everything that I wanted to say about loops. So just kind of concluding with a sort of conceptual explanation of when you should use these without really taking too much of a look at any code, since many of the coding examples we've already seen kind of address some of these different points. So getting into the next video, we're now going to transition from loops, and we're going to start taking a look at the other half of the content for this chapter, which is going to be dealing with handling files in our programs. We're going to be looking at file input and output.